I wanted to know, I guess, first, how long were you interested in Israel and Palestine?
Interested in terms of politically involved, really it was the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon that first drew my attention. A lot of my political activism had focused on immigrant rights in Central America. I lived in Spanish-speaking countries and spoke fluent Spanish, and Spanish and Portuguese was my undergraduate major. Um, I was still an undergrad at the time in 1982. And so I was pretty deeply immersed in like Central America solidarity and working with Central American immigrants at the time. And with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, it was just so horrifying watching the news every night. And then as I started to delve into it and learn more about it, so absolutely infuriating to learn about the injustices there and how much I didn't know. So, I mean, I saw kind of a real parallel to Central America in that respect. So, during my time at Berkeley in the 1980s, I was really deeply involved with an organization we formed there called CAFIAT, the Committee for Academic Freedom in the Israeli-occupied territories, and involved in a lot of campus and off-campus activism in support of Palestinian rights, and especially in the occupied territories, which were, you know, in the early 1980s, the occupation was still recent enough that it felt like it could be undone. Then when I finished graduate school and got my first job teaching Latin American history, because I continued to focus on Latin America in my official studies, in part because I was in the history department. And it was just a lot more congenial to me politically than Middle East studies in the history department, than Middle East, than you know, the faculty and students that I would be working with there. I really thought hard about my activism and what it would mean starting a new job as a brand new coming in professor, and just knowing how volatile the topic of Palestinian rights is. And I decided that at least until I got my feet on the ground, I should probably focus my work on Latin America and like make that my public persona at the university, and not really talk about Palestinian rights. That lasted, I started the job in 1990, fall of 1990, and my resolution lasted until January of 1991, with the first US invasion of Iraq. And I had kind of quietly found one ally on campus who was the new chaplain on campus, who also had been really involved in Palestinian rights and had made the decision, and starting the job, he started the same time I did, that it was time to be a little bit more quiet about that. But the college canceled classes the day after the U.S. invaded, and called for volunteers to do like teach-in activities. And there was a lot of student protest on campus. And so my colleague and I, the chaplain, decided to offer a workshop on Israel-Palestine in the current crisis. So we both like came out that day. And to my great surprise, in my fourth year review, and I still really stayed away except for that one event, and kept my focus on Latin America. But at my fourth year review, the chair of my department wrote an evaluation of me, which he had to do for my fourth year review. And it was all about that talk, and how as a professor, I had to be really careful of what I said outside the classroom as well as inside the classroom. And he said, I'll never forget this line, that expressing opinions outside of the mainstream can make students feel silenced, even if it's done outside the classroom. So it was like, wow. So he's telling me I don't have freedom of speech in the classroom, and I don't even have freedom of speech outside the classroom.
On the latest thing you said, how do you feel professors should orient themselves, like in and outside of the classroom?
So I think it can answer that question in two ways. One is that especially, and there has also been a move in institutions of higher education against tenure and against full-time employment and against the kind of job security. So a real increase in contingent faculty and decrease in tenured and tenure track faculty. So one way of answering the question is what do professors have to do for their own job security and their own futures? And that is a serious question that professors need to think about. And I think a lot of professors feel like they have no job security and that their positions are very vulnerable and that their professional futures are very tenuous. So I think people do need to, and I don't fault people for taking that issue into account when they're making decisions. However, there still are plenty of faculty who have job security and have tenure. And I think we, and I include myself among them, have a real responsibility to not be cowed by witch hunts and to silence ourselves and to accept perspectives and narratives. Like we should not accept perspectives and narratives that are false and that are racist and that are genocidal, and that we have a responsibility to speak out. And I would say everybody has a responsibility to speak out, but some people have a lot more to lose by speaking out than others. So the more security you have, the more responsibility you have.
You spoke early on about some of the parallels between Israel, Palestine, and Latin America. Would you be able to talk about that for a little bit?
One set of parallels has to do with the US role in both regions, and concomitant to that, the fact that the US public in general, and certainly in educational institutions, is taught a very skewed narrative, if any at all, about the US role in those regions. So like part of my coming to consciousness was not only learning about what had happened there, but how involved the US had been and what the US involvement had been. So that's one set of parallels. Another set of parallels is the huge power imbalances in both regions that are kind of obscured and distorted to the extent that you had in the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan talking about the threat of the Sandinistas and how our national security was threatened and how Nicaragua was closer to Texas or Florida, or I can't remember exactly what his statement was, but like trying to create this terror and fear. And we see the same kinds of analysis of like narratives being promoted, like the Palestinians are so dangerous and the threat to the security of Israel and even of the United States. Narratives about them being just the manifestations of evil empires that are using them, are using poor and powerless people to achieve nefarious aims, and to try to and the narrative that the United States is always on the side of good. So whatever the United States is doing must be supporting the good guys. And even if it requires a lot of militarization and killing and destruction of land, water, people, it's all for the good. So because the United States is behind it and the United States always represents good, and the struggles of oppressed people for bare minimum justice are turned into huge threats to the most powerful interests in the world, including the United States.
You had said that a lot of times in the US, we kind of maybe aren't critically thinking about these issues because we have these narratives like deeply rooted, especially maybe even in history classrooms early on, with the way we tell it and what we emphasize on, like presidents doing all these great things and fixing everything. Is it similar for what Israelis maybe learn in their education?
Absolutely. There's been a lot of talk about settler colonialism as a framework for understanding US history and also for understanding Israeli history, and perhaps for understanding some of the um, instinctive harmony between the US and Israel. That is, this idea that white Europeans, that people who aren't white Europeans are just kind of incidental and don't really have any rights, and that it's the goal of white Europeans to go and take their land and turn it into create white European outposts around the world. That's sort of part of the ethos of settler colonialism. And then these colonizers feel constantly under threat by the people who they have displaced and dispossessed. And wow, just today, Leonard Peltier was denied parole for I can't remember how manyth time, and that there's an inordinate amount of violence necessary to maintain a settler colonial dominance over a dispossessed population. I think that like settler colonial ideas and analysis are pretty deeply rooted in the US educational system, which certainly makes it easier to just kind of transfer that narrative to Israel and say, yes, these poor white Europeans are so under threat by the people they've dispossessed and displaced, and that their very existence depends on denying the existence of those they've dispossessed and displaced. And, you think about like the contradictions when we study US history, like how fundamental ideas about freedom are in understanding, the United States is the land of the free, and, that the United States was founded on principles of freedom and equality. It's like, no, it wasn't. The United States was founded on principles of dispossession and slavery. How can you say it was founded on principles of freedom? It was founded on principles of settler colonialism. But living in this kind of state of denial is part of the settler colonial mind frame and the contortions you have to go into to maintain that. But if you look at the history of US-Israel relations, you can also see that there's some very clear geostrategic reasons behind it. So settler colonialism, you could say, plays a role, but it's not such a direct role. Like, we're settler colonizers and they're settler colonizers, so we like them because they're settler colonizers. But for the geostrategic regions is the United States' concern about the Middle East in the Cold War context, which is when the US alliance with Israel really develops, is during the Cold War, right? And its fear of Arab nationalism and of all anti-colonial nationalisms, and its need for a dependable ally in the Middle East. And when I say because of Middle Eastern oil, and because of the US desire for world dominance and anti-communism, and that Israel was a reliable ally because insofar as it had maintained that is, popular movements in the Arab world were a threat to Arab dictatorships that the United States supported. So those dictatorships were always had this fundamental weakness that they had no popular support from their populations, even though they were supported by the United States and they're called moderate. As long as they supported the United States, it didn't matter how repressive they were at home. But that Israel Israel's government had a popular mandate, having expelled the population support it, and was much more stable in that respect. So there's a lot more, and so one could make the several steps argument that being a settler colonial country enabled it to have that kind of stability and popular support among the population. But there's multiple factors at stake in the U.S. relationship with Israel. So the settler colonial nature of the two regimes is only one piece, although it's also true that if you look at, say, U.S. in the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand are two of the big U.S. allies, but at the same time, Japan and South Korea are U.S. allies. And, the way that those Cold War alliances developed is not all about things like settler colonialism and racism. The Cold War and geostrategic interests play a huge role too.
So I probably should have started with this, but you had emailed me and kind of said, like, this is what you're most interested in right now, unless I'm mixing words. But what are some of, I guess, the latest updates? Because it is hard to watch. And if you can kind of fill me in on what you've been looking into recently. And I feel like every day there's a new scandal and a new report. And then kind of how this relates to when you were becoming aware of it in the 80s, because you had talked about how it was like just so awful to witness. And I think that's what a lot of young people are kind of saying now, especially on social media. And it's just absolutely brutal.
In one respect, just having to watch what Israel is doing in Gaza is so horrific. And on the other side, watching the United States fall over itself trying to defend what Israel is doing in Gaza is so horrific. And on yet another level, the attempts in Congress and beyond to silence any voice that challenges this dominant narrative of defense of genocide, and the ways that charges of anti-Semitism are being used to try to stifle and silence any whisper of challenge to what Israel is doing. And, we see this coming out of the Israeli government. We see it coming out of the US government. We see it coming out of institutions of higher education. And like the whole national obsession with anti-Semitism is really shocking to me when you look at all of the kinds of racism and discrimination that exist in the United States without remark. And then, one college student at some obscure university makes an anti-Semitic comment, and it's all over the front pages of the paper. I've been thinking about that myself, how, I'm Jewish, and I have been exposed to anti-Semitism in my life on multiple occasions in different ways, and especially working in Latin America, where anti-Semitism is practically part of the culture. Most people have never met anybody Jewish, and they just have like ideas about Jews that came probably through the Catholic Church or whatever. But comparing that to sexism, which I also experience, I would say, far more frequently and than anti-Semitism in my life, practically every day. Of course, both sexism and anti-Semitism in some cases, and again, I would say far more frequently with sexism than with anti-Semitism, have really severe effects on people's lives. In the case of my life, they've been mostly annoyances because I'm very privileged. But again, the way that anti-Semitism is turned, well, so one piece is the way that anti-Semitism is like magnified and become this constant topic of conversation, as opposed to other much more egregious forms of hatred and discrimination that destroy people's lives, including, of course, genocide against Palestinians. But the other is the ways that pro-Israel organizations in the United States have succeeded in convincing a large sector of the US public, and especially of the educated elite in Congress and in higher education, that criticism of Israel is automatically anti-Semitic. And, a lot of this relies on a definition of anti-Semitism that was written by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, that suggests that criticism of the state of Israel is an example of anti-Semitism. And quite a few institutions of higher education have adopted that definition officially. Almost half the states in the United States have at the state level adopted it. The Trump administration adopted it for federal agencies. So, it really mixes up something called anti-Semitism with political positions, political debate, and makes it really hard to have political debate on campus. And, on my own campus, our Students for Justice in Palestine organization held a silent vigil, and people held signs. And one of the signs said, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And the coordinator of student activities called in the board of SJP to talk about this fact. And she said, one of your signs said from the river to the sea. And we said, yeah, so is that a prohibited phrase? Like, we didn't see that anywhere in the rules about student demonstrations, that you couldn't use that phrase. We really tried to follow all the rules. We read them very carefully. And, if you're going to prohibit certain language, you have to tell us. You can't just come at us afterwards. And she said, well, no, it's not prohibited, but it made students feel unsafe. Really? Like, anyone can say they feel unsafe. I'm not going to deny what people feel, but so does anybody just get to shut down debate because they say it makes them feel unsafe? I feel like the language is used very, very broadly here. So instead of asking the student, well, why did you feel unsafe? Did anybody threaten you? It's like, no, we just have to tell them that they have to be very careful what they say because they could make people feel unsafe.
You said when you were younger that you felt early on in the 80s that something could be done. How do you feel now about things? Because I know like Norman, he's kind of gone like back and forth that he felt like more hopeless, but now he feels more hopeful. But in general, he just wants to be like a chronicler. How do you feel about the current state?
It's not exactly that what I meant to say about in the early 1980s. What I meant to say is that an end to the occupation seemed more realistic than it does now. And a two-state solution felt more realistic in the early 1980s than it does now. So I guess there's two ways of analyzing the current conjuncture in terms of hopefulness and hopelessness. On one hand, just watching what's happening in Gaza and thinking about the potential future of Gaza makes you feel incredibly hopeless. It's almost impossible to see any way out for the people of Gaza that has any hope in it. I feel like the potential for a two-state solution is much grimmer now than it was in the early 1980s. But a two-state solution isn't the only possible solution. And I'm just remembering a conference I went to maybe 15 years ago on BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And a lot of the speakers at the conference were saying it's time to give up on the two-state solution and go back to the one-state solution. And this is why we support a one-state solution. And the people who were speaking were mostly older generation. And then a young woman in the audience, a graduate student, stood up and said, I'm writing my dissertation on the possibility of a no-state solution. Can't we talk about the no-state solution? And it just felt like such a breath of fresh air. Like, we're sort of locked in this debate, one state, two states, one state, two states. And, I think, one of the things that the post-colonial era has taught us is that having a state doesn't solve all your problems, and that in a system of global apartheid and global economic inequality, and world financial economic system dominated by a few major powers, it's going to take more than having a state. And I should also say that this isn't really something new. And I recommend this book to everybody because I love it so much. But Adam Geditu's book, World Making After Empire, that looks at how anti-colonial leaders in the first and the second half of the 20th century, national sovereignty was only a very small piece of how they wanted to remake the world. So, this concept of world making. And it had a lot more to do with restructuring the way the politics and economics of the planet was organized rather than just creating another state. But that the colonial powers were not about to let that happen. And so she looks at how their projects and goals and dreams were cut back and back and back and back until what they were left with was national sovereignty. And then, we kind of anachronistically look back and say, oh, well, that's what they always wanted was national sovereignty. Well, they did, but that was only a small piece of what they wanted, but that was what they got out of all the things they wanted. We live in a world of nation states, so it's really hard to imagine solutions that aren't based on just creating another nation state. But, if you look around the world, a lot of post-colonial nation states are rife with, like, having a nation state didn't solve the problems, especially the problems for the poor in those new nation states. So, several Latin American countries have moved towards the concept of plurinationalism and written it into their constitutions, and that, Latin American countries were some of the first colonized countries to become independent and to form nation states, mostly in the early 19th century, shortly after the United States. And most of those new nation states, like many new nation states around the world, were also, in a way, ethno-states, ethno-nationalist states, where the Creole, or mostly Mestizo and Spanish-descended minorities, ruled over large indigenous populations who were still marginalized and excluded and exploited by the new nation states. And, over the course of 2 centuries, this dynamic and dichotomy has really been maintained in Latin America. And not until the end of the 20th century have indigenous movements making claims to their political rights pushed forward this idea of plurinationalism, and that the state can't be just the state of the Creole elites, that indigenous peoples have to be recognized with peoples and the states have to be plurinational. I guess in terms of hope, I would hope that something better than a 2-state solution could be in the future of Palestine. And long ago, people talked about the concept of a binational state. And in some ways, I feel like Latin America's push towards this idea of plurinationalism has opened the door to think about ways that a state can be other than just a nation state. And I think a lot of Palestinian activists now talk about, there are multiple different groups of Palestinians. There's Palestinians inside the 1948 borders. There's Palestinians in the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza. There's Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and there's Palestinians in the diaspora, those who were mostly expelled in 1948, some expelled in 1967, who can't go back. And that all of those Palestinians have rights. And all those Palestinians have rights in Palestine. So any hopeful solution has to take into account the rights of all of those people. And I'm just thinking about a comparison because I just came back from Colombia, South America, where I've been working for several decades with communities that are displaced, have been displaced by a multinational mine, a coal mine, in a very remote region in northern Colombia, mostly Afro-descended and indigenous communities. And there's one community in particular that was violently displaced in 2001. And despite numerous promises by the company and internationally sponsored agreements to reconstruct that community, like it can't be reconstructed where it was before because now it's a mine, but to resettle the community in comparable lands and to sort of like to recreate the social fabric of the community. It hasn't happened. And, I was thinking a lot about, and the community now is very divided because the mine has offered different perks to different people. Some people, this was 20 years ago that it happened. So some people are still just basically displaced. They're homeless. They have no place to be. Some people have gotten packages from the company and moved to a city and found some other way to live. And, the community, for them, that community doesn't exist anymore. They have a new life. And the community is divided in terms of what exactly they want. And what we were arguing with the company is that you're the one who displaced these people. All of them have rights that you have to acknowledge, even if they don't. And the company was saying, well, we can't just reconstruct the community because not everyone wants that anymore. And like, well, of course, not everyone wants that anymore. It's been 20 years. People have found different paths. Some people have found no paths. Some people have found okay paths. Most people have not found okay paths. But that all of those people have rights and all of those rights have to be recognized. And I think any solution for Israel and Palestine has to recognize the rights of all Palestinians, even if they're in different circumstances and even if they don't all want the same thing. All of them have rights that have been violated over the course of 50 or 75 years. And there has to be some kind of restitution and reparations for all that destruction. When the first time I heard the chant "From the River to the Sea," shortly after October 7th, I thought, why are people saying that? Let's just talk about ending the genocide. And like, why do we have to be talking about, do the people who are saying it even know what they're saying? Are they saying they want a one-state solution? Are they saying they want a two-state solution? Like, let's just stick to what's more crucial here. Israel out of Gaza, and then we'll talk about long-term solutions. But the more I thought about it over time, the more I felt like, yes, saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, like that really has to be the solution, that the rights of all Palestinians, no matter where they are, have to be prioritized.
Thank you.